So maybe just in short, like who or what is City in the Making, or Stad in de Maak, as it's called in Dutch. You could say that we're an unconventional developer or redeveloper with a pool of 60 spaces in Rotterdam. More or less unintentionally, we've become a rather successful interim programmer of vacant urban property. And this is where it started. We got hold of 2 buildings that were left abandoned by their owner, a social housing provider in the city. They have about 45,000 apartments, so it's a rather large one. For them, these buildings were too bad to rent and too expensive to fix. So let's say from an economic point of view, they were considered toxic assets. But to us, they were useful spaces, rough, but a crucial resource in the city, and now stuck, not in use. When we discussed with the owner, why are they in that situation, they explained, well, the only viable solution is demolition, but there is no money for new construction. We have to keep in mind this was not so long after the 2008 financial crisis. So a lot of the housing providers in the Netherlands were actually in a pretty bad shape. Their only option seemed to be to put these buildings in coma for a period of 10 years to come. And we were questioning whether we could turn things around a bit so that we could imagine a different future for them. And now the owner would have to take a loss of about 60,000 euros on all sorts of expenses during this 10-year period, even if those buildings would be in hibernation. So basically, if they would be closed. And we proposed to them to write off this sum in one day, or let's say on day one, transfer it to us, and provide us in that way with a starting budget to keep the buildings active. So instead of them keeping them asleep and still having 60,000 euros of expenses for them, we in turn would keep them awake for the same amount of money. It was for them an unusual proposition, but in the end we reached a deal. So now we had a bit of budget to fix up the buildings and to make them acceptable again, both in terms of safety, because they were in pretty bad state, in terms of the use, because they were not usable in their initial state, but also for the look and the feel in the street. So we engaged a small group of people, which was motivated to use them, and in return for that was also motivated to make them usable. Suddenly we got sort of a hands-on community going. Now let's have a look inside on what this has been generating. Inside the buildings, you will find a variety of living spaces for a range of living patterns, from individual to collective, from a pause living for divorced people to space for labor migrants, pure living spaces to mixed live and work spaces for self-employed workers. It's quite a diversity. But you pay rent to use them, even if that's a very acceptable rent for Rotterdam standards. Maybe even more important are the common spaces, which are shared spaces, also reproductive spaces. That means they are also function economically. People can make a living in them. They are collectively organized and accessed by a pool of people in the buildings, and they're also open for others to use. So others in the street, in the neighborhood, but also in the wider city. And you don't pay rent to use them. That's very important. And it's not per se just limited to the boundaries of the buildings. Activities are also spilling over into the street, into the neighborhoods, and something like that's more or less happening by itself. In quite a short time period of a few years, we managed to activate a pool of such shipwrecked buildings, mostly from the same owner, so this social housing provider, for a limited defined period of time. So most of them are for a period of 3 to 5, sometimes 10 years, which we can use them. But after that, they go basically back to the owner. Now, how did we start managing this? Along the way, we developed a certain approach. And one of the important things was a quite early decision which we made to use basically 2/3 of the spaces for living and approximately 1/3 for common spaces. And it also means that each building automatically has its own common space. The living spaces provide for very affordable rent levels. That rent is crucial to keep this setup going. Somehow the whole setup has to be paid from something. So there's a small flow of income generated by the rent, and it keeps the organization and the works going. But affordable rent, so the affordability level, is crucial to allow a wider group of people to have access to these buildings without putting much pressure on their existential situation. So the affordability of this rent is like super important. The shared spaces are seen as commons. So they are owned and managed by the collective and for the collective. And more we try to understand the buildings as a whole actually as commons. And here there's a drawing of how these commons are somehow unfolding. Over time, more and more things are actually being practiced and taken on as commons, as for instance, my own collection of books, now serving a much wider community on my table, which is used by others when I'm not there. And this happens more or less smoothly most of the time. So it's very interesting that that is basically, it's expanding without having to give much thought to that. The community which is using that is a somewhat surprising mix of, on the one side, quite educated work migrants, self-employed people in the creative sector, students, but also enterprising loners, temporary homeless people, couch sleepers, status refugees, and many more. People that often go under the radar in the conventional housing context, so or also under the radar of the conventional housing providers. And we notice that it's a growing group of people which is looking for space. And we notice it because we are getting more and more requests of people to, you know, like, do we have space for them to house them or to house their initiatives or their practices? So it's a growing pool. And in hindsight, we discovered that there is a sort of mindset which grew around our way of handling this. It's basically based on self-reliance, cooperation, sharing economy is very important, learning by doing. When we started, we had no idea how to take on this, but we gave ourselves, let's say, the time and the opportunity to learn as things are going. We use this temporary use as a training ground for upscaling, but also to discover how maybe things could become permanent. Reclaiming public domain is equally important in that, being at the street or being former public housing assets. So that's a fundamental thing in the back of all of this. And resilience and sustainability are, of course, also important factors in this. A principle of governance is also becoming more and more important, not only as a consequence of these commoning principles, but also because we limit let's say, the amount of resources which we have, which we can spend on coordination. So instead, it's actually very important that buildings get managed by their own communities. And for that, we're experimenting, or we have put in place sociocracy as a model. Slowly, we're rolling it out, discovering what can be done with this. So first buildings are since about a year experimenting with this. So as said, it's very important that buildings are managed by their communities and not by an organization. That's why handing them over, let's say, to be governed by their communities is important. And as you might have guessed, a certain sense of stubbornness, of do-it-yourself spirit and autonomy is getting cultivated in all of that. Now that's working for okay for most of the things, but there are limits to what such a community can do in and with these buildings. And it's one of the reasons why we're also looking how to go beyond temporality. And for one is because this temporary status makes us very dependent on a stream of shipwrecked buildings, properties to feed on, a crisis situation to secure this, because otherwise you would not have these shipwrecked properties, and owners with toxic assets to deliver them to us. And that's in the end not a really great long-term context or a worldview. Also, it takes quite some time for a group of people to form and transition into a robust community. And we see that more and more often we are not given that time, or at the point where you have such a community going, it's not given enough time to blossom in these buildings. So there is also a limit in that sense of temporality, or having buildings on a temporary granting. But there is also another thing. We will never be able to make substantial investments to create the context we believe in. So decent, low environmental impact buildings specifically set up to give communities their best home, their best spatial setting. So we decided to see if we can become property owners ourselves, collective property owners, that is. We attempted buying buildings, and this is the first one which you see here, a building that could host such a community. It's a building which also had interesting past history as a sort of a hotel of last resort. So it was a place for people who would otherwise end up in the street, houseless or homeless. That the organization which ran that building moved to another venue. And this one was brought to the market, and we thought with its history, it's a very interesting building. Not only in its structure, it was quite good. Let's say the layout with a large kitchen, restaurant on the ground floor, but also the history which it had. It was like quite tempting for us to work with. So we tried to get that building. It was properly wrecked inside. Structurally had quite some damage. Actually, if you would look at the building, it had a negative value, so you would have to spend actually much more than what the structure in itself would be worth. So actually, you would be bidding for the location in the city. And now that was not only something which we attempted to do, but also a bunch of other property developers, and because they are converting this sort of buildings into lofts, they easily could outbid us, because they work in a quite different market than the non-for-profit market in which we are. So this one we lost. After that, we tried to get a couple of buildings. They were sold by the owner, or put in the market under the condition that it would get a socially relevant future. Now we thought, like, okay, with that we are in a better situation. So we came up with a plan that involved housing for drifters, along with a range of community functions for the street and for the neighborhood. And on top of our bid of about 450,000, just to get this site, basically, we would have to spend another €500,000 to make it usable. But a bunch of Amsterdam developers could do that too, and then sell it at premium price. Hence, they handed in a higher bid. The seller was satisfied with lofts as a socially relevant option, and we were basically gone in this situation. Up next was the municipality of Rotterdam, a public governance body, mind you. They have been putting a number of buildings, publicly owned buildings, on the real estate market, sports centers, but also a lot of schools. And we thought that we could make a good chance to get such a building. Nice and sturdy buildings, perfect for housing communities. So we went again to the detailed process of assessing a proper bidding price. It's quite a lot of work. You have to understand basically what is the state of the buildings, what you have to invest to make them not only usable for such a community, but to make them basically climate proof. So, you know, like energy efficient, make them low impact buildings. There's a lot of work to be done. So this is something you have to go through, and in the back of that, you have to keep in mind what others, maybe with commercial purposes, are going to bid. So we went through this. We handed in our bid 2 times, and two times we lost it. So no. Now there are a couple of reasons why actually it's very difficult to make a dent in this situation. We are basically hitting a persistent obstacle here. First of all, it's basically impossible to compete with a speculative market in a booming housing economy, when you are aiming to realize affordable housing, that's sort of like it just doesn't get together. Then there is a lack of understanding of why community-led or cooperative housing should not be treated like for-profit enterprises, for instance, by a municipality which is selling off these assets. So when community-led or cooperative housing group is doing something with them, their circumstances are very different than what for-profit enterprises can do. And last but not least, there are actually with the government, with the municipality, there are no instruments, being them political or legal, which make it possible to acknowledge that special status of anti-speculative third category development. So to in some way to advance them, to help them. In the back of this, there's of course something else important going on, and that's the issue that the price of land in the city has been going up over decades. So if you look at the price of housing has been steadily going up, but actually not the price of constructing housing. So what then has been going up is the location. You basically pay for your place in the city, and that's basically that's a matter of speculation. And that makes realizing affordable housing in the city today a very, very difficult thing. While all this has been going on, City in the Making over the past 2 years has entered its largest endeavor. It has taken on the program of soon to be demolished street in Rotterdam. It's called the Almond Street. 52 housing units. The houses are again not in too good state. Their foundations are crumbling away. So the owner understood that it's basically not viable anymore to maintain them. That it's better to demolish them and to rebuild something else there. So that means that the inhabitants have to be moved out, and they are provided alternative housing by the owner. While these residents are being moved out and given alternative housing, City in the Making is bringing in other people to either occupy the apartments or to occupy the common spaces, because again we are using here the 2/3 housing space, 1/3 common space sort of principle for these buildings. If you look at the group of people who is brought in, you could say they're sort of like nomads, people for whom this short time framework, this short frame of time which we are given here, let's say they could come maximally for a period of a year, it's not limiting or endangering reality, but something which opens a possibility. And of course, this is like it's only a very small segment of the total amount of people in Rotterdam which is looking for housing or which is urgently looking for housing. We're here speaking about people for whom it's not an immediate emergency. They have other possibilities, and short-term housing is something which just opens some chances for them, but it's not their last resort. Part of that has been an even more explicit short stay option, a boarding house. So it's sort of again this going back to this really short stay possibility in the city. Because of the difficulty to build in a community really ground up, we've been looking also for orphaned communities in the neighborhood and looking to give them a space. And as things moved on, we've been also providing space to emerging facilities, emerging activities, which during the process just popped up and have been, finding their space, finding their roots in the street. So here you have a sort of a map of, or a drawing of, on the one hand, the initiatives which have been invited in And on the other hand, the initiatives which have been popping up and finding their space in the building, so in the common and shared spaces. And apart from that, there is also quite a lot, 2/3 of living spaces there. Now, Corona was an interesting break point. We were afraid that it would basically almost terminate the activity there. But interestingly enough, it has provided for a sort of a bonding moment in the history, or in the making of this street. Suddenly, food distribution got organized. Neighbors started to take care for each other. So this was actually an interesting moment coming up. But now, because I explained it's a street which is facing demolition. Now, when basically all is up and running, we are destined to abandon ship, to put attention to this reality, and to also to the difficulty of communities to secure the place in the city. We've organized a proper demolition opera as part of the opera festival in Rotterdam, and here you see an image of it when the opera was being performed. So where next? Obviously, we have seen this reality coming. We've decided to follow 2 tracks in this. One is to see if we can make this boarding house into a nomadic entity, traveling through the city where opportunity arises. Of course, it's a vulnerable situation. You're depending on what's available. It's all the time short term. You're all the time in some way on the run with it. That's why we also keep this second track, looking for permanent buildings, trying to set up a secure permanent space in the city. As part of this first, let's say, nomadic boarding house sort of idea, the community of this street is self-organizing a 4 weeks work session to understand how they can pick up base and move elsewhere. And that's actually starting today, as you can see. And as part of the second, let's say, to see how we can get a more permanent foothold in the city, we've been co-initiating with a number of other organizations and initiatives the Dutch version of the Mietshouses Syndicate in the Netherlands. It's called Vrijkoop. So the principle of Vrijkoop is basically that you have collective ownership of properties which the members then rent. It's self-managed by the residents, so there is not some overarching organization which is renting out. The buildings are, each of the buildings is basically run and managed by their residents. They're taken from the market, so they're secured. They're affordable on the long term. Your capital contribution doesn't give you more or less say in this community, and there's solidarity among projects. So we see this as a good base for such communities to emerge. At the moment, there are 6 groups which are part of this Dutch version of the Mietshouses Syndicate, Vrijkoop. And there are 2 projects which are being launched. One is Eco Village, which is at the moment under construction. It's a quite ambitious project with really a lot of houses. I'm really glad to see that they are going. So this is a short overview of where we stand, of where we are today, and that's what I would like to share with you today.